Okay, it's Tuesday, April the 7th, and we are ready for history. And we are going to continue on with Theodore Roosevelt and the events that happened during his terms. Now, this is two terms. Remember, one he took over after McKinley was assassinated, and then another term that he was elected to. So we almost have a full 8 years here. And this is a busy time. Things are really happening, and a lot of it has to do with President Roosevelt himself. He is very busy. He is an active president, and he believes he should use his time to get as much accomplished as he can. So, there's a lot going on. But before we start in on this, I wanted to show you. I promised you the other day that I tried to draw him and I was going to show you. So, here's what I came up with. I was pretty proud of it. I was looking at a full photograph of his face, and then I just started with looking at the lines and looking at how, where they interacted with the different other lines. Okay, so Theodore Roosevelt is number 26, and I have a quote here on, you do not have to write this down, but I thought this showed a lot about who he was. It says, far and away the best prize that life has to offer is the chance to work hard at work worth doing. So that does sum up a lot about his philosophy of life, that he thought you should work hard, that you should get as much accomplished as you can. He was not going to go down without a fight. And then I have a picture here of one of the first teddy bears made. This one is actually in one of the Smithsonian museums. This one would have been made around 1903. And the story is based off of Theodore Roosevelt. He went on one of his hunting expeditions he was famous for, and this was in about 1903. And when wealthy people went on these hunting expeditions, you went with someone and they went ahead and they kind of made sure that there was something there for you to hunt. So really, you got to hunt, but you got to hunt because they made sure it was there. So he was supposed to be hunting bears. Well, the man went ahead and he couldn't find anything. The only thing he found was his cub, and he tied it to a tree. And then brought Theodore Roosevelt there and said, well, there's your bear, shoot it. And he was like, this is not hunting. I'm not going to shoot, first of all, a cub that's been, and it's tied to a tree. That's not hunting. And so he refused to shoot it. Well, a cartoonist drew this portrayal of the incident, the story that got out in the newspapers. And then some man who owned a shop decided that this was an opportunity to make some money, and he made what he called Teddy's Bear, and it caught on, and eventually it became the teddy bear. And so it is named after Theodore Roosevelt because of his refusal to shoot this bear. Okay, so there we go. Now, I need you to know this before we get into some of the events. Every time we get to a new president, we have to ask the question, what kind of president do we have? Okay? Because every president thinks differently about their roles as president. So remember Cleveland. When I picture Cleveland, I think of this, right? He was the guard dog. He thought that his job was not to get a whole bunch of things passed, but to make sure that the government was being used wisely and the people weren't being taken advantage of. And there's a lot to be said for that, okay? So, but we have to say, what kind of president is Theodore Roosevelt? Theodore Roosevelt is what we would call progressive. Progressive generally means that he favored the interest of the regular working people over the big business. So he was known for coming in and doing this thing called trust busting. A trust is a big business that would take over a whole industry, like railroads or steel or banking, and they would just take over the whole thing. And then they had a lot of control over the prices. this is not good for normal people, okay? For just regular working class people. This is not good because they're setting the prices and they're setting them high and we can't do anything about it. So Theodore Roosevelt comes in and he starts busting up these organizations, and it's called trust busting. And he even takes one to court, and it goes all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court rules in favor of President Roosevelt instead of the trust. And that set a big precedent. And that, now what's interesting is that he didn't bust up every trust. He thought that some of them were good, but he was going to go after the ones that he believed were harmful to the people. So I think that's interesting. It wasn't like get rid of all of them. He had an understanding of how they could be useful, but he also had an understanding of how they could be harmful, and he was willing to tackle them. He was willing to tackle them. Which makes me think of something else. He was willing to do this when he was in New York. Okay, he was the governor of New York, and he was taking on these big businesses then, and they didn't like what he was coming in and doing. So they were basically like, what can we do with him? Where can we put him to get him out of our hair? Well, guess what? They decided to make him vice president, because as vice president, he basically had no power. So they're like, let's just make him vice president. What was the problem with that? McKinley was shot. And so now this guy that they tried to get out of their hair and tried to make him have no power, all of a sudden had all of the power, which he was not afraid to use. So that's really interesting. And so he was, another word for him is active. He called his position as president, he said, was a bully pulpit. Now, first of all, we have to understand Theodore Roosevelt's use of the word bully. His use of the word bully was like good, was like that bully, that was wonderful, that was good, hey, bully. It was like a word for cool or wonderful or influential. Okay, so his bully pulpit doesn't mean that he thought he could beat people up and tell them what to do. And a pulpit is where a preacher preaches, right? So a bully pulpit meant it was a good use of power, that he felt like he should use his power to do good. He had a pulpit, so he should use it. And there are a lot of presidents, though, who feel like that would be an overuse of power, Cleveland would have thought that way, that I am to protect the people, but I'm not to assert all of what I want. Theodore Roosevelt did not agree with that. He was like, this is my chance. I have power. I can get something done, and I'm going to do it. And one way he did that was to use his executive orders. Executive means as the president, he can sign it into law. But this is not done very much during peacetime. This is done a lot during wartime. Abraham Lincoln used his executive order when he made the Emancipation Proclamation. He didn't wait for Congress. He used his executive order. Well, Theodore Roosevelt uses this power thousands of times, or about 1,000 times as president. And most of the time he used it was to declare a national park. And he did it to protect all of this. The United States at this time is growing. Well, what do you need to grow? What do you need? You need houses. How do you make those houses? Out of lumber. Where do you get the lumber? Trees. Where do you get those trees? All those pretty places that houses haven't been built yet, right? So he wanted to protect that land, and he wanted to protect those trees so that people, generations coming after him, would be able to enjoy it. So when we're able to go to Grand Canyon, when we're able to go to Yosemite, when we're able to go to Yellowstone, most of those we have Theodore Roosevelt to thank for. And he used his executive order. He didn't wait for Congress to approve him. He said, I'm president, I can get this done if I want. And he used his power. He also felt like we should show our power and get involved in world affairs when we could. one of his big phrases was speak softly and carry a big stick. So if I speak softly and carry a big stick, what it means is I don't necessarily have to use my stick if you see me having it, right? What if I'm walking and there's people coming up and they're planning on hurting me? Okay, they're going to attack me and I'm coming, and then they see a big guy coming up behind me with a big stick or a club. Are they going to mess with me? No, because I'm protected. They're going to run off. Did I ever have to use my big stick or my big club? No. All I had to do was show it. And that's kind of how Theodore Roosevelt believed, that we should have power, and we won't, if we use it well, we won't necessarily have to use it very much. So let everyone know your power, then you won't have to use it as much. You show that you have it, and then everyone understands and kind of backs off. And I'm going to show you a way in which he does that a little bit later. Okay? Do you have these different things down? He's progressive. He's active. He's using his executive order. He's involved in what's going on in the world. And we're going to see that in some of the things I'm going to show you here. Okay? All right. We have some more worker strikes going on. PA is Pennsylvania. So there's a big strike at a Pennsylvania coal mine. President sends in troops. But guess what? We've heard this before, right? But what did the troops do here? President Roosevelt's troops go in to protect the strikers. Because a lot of times what happened with the mine bosses would hire thugs to come in and beat up the strikers so that they wouldn't strike. And so President Roosevelt, instead of sending troops to break up the strike, sent troops to protect the strikers, and then brought representatives of both sides back to the White House to figure out an agreement. And he worked out an agreement between both sides. The president himself worked out an agreement, and that was mostly favorable to whom? Guess what? The workers, not the bosses, and then sent them back. Do you think this made him popular as president? Yes, he was a very popular president among the people. The big business didn't necessarily like him very much, and you can tell why. He was for the people. He would go out and make speeches and rile people up and get them excited. He let the people see him as a father. He had a playtime at the White House from I think it was 5 to 6, where he played with his children. One thing I heard today on a show I watched, which was interesting, was that he showed the newspapers things that he was doing with his kids. But at the same time, I had read that Edith was trying to protect them from the press. So they probably had a little bit of an argument about that sometimes, I can imagine. But he wanted the people to see him as a real person. He would go out on hikes. He would go out riding on his horse. He wanted to be seen by the people. And here's someone coming after someone who was assassinated. He wasn't afraid. He didn't have his big Secret Service around him protecting him. No, he was the people's president. All right, now here is where we see him getting involved in world affairs. The Russians and the Japanese were starting a war. They were disagreeing and having a war. Instead of just saying, well, that's them, they've got their own affairs, they've got their own problems, he actually gets involved with both countries, sits down with them and helps them establish a treaty and helps them reconcile their war. We weren't involved. We had no part in it. But Theodore Roosevelt used his power as a strong nation to get involved and help other countries. And because of his influence in this war and working out this treaty, he won the Nobel Peace Prize for this. Okay, now here's something a lot of people disagree with, and you can have your own opinion about this, and I want you to have your own opinion about it. So I'm going to tell you the facts, and you decide what you think. All right, so we've got a very strong president. One of the things that he sees is that we need a way for our ships to get very quickly around the world. And right now, they don't. They have to go all the way around South America and around. But if we had a canal that went right through kind of in between the lower United States and South America, okay, in Panama, if we had a canal that went right through that area, then our ships could get quickly out if we ever needed to send them out. So Congress approached Columbia. Columbia owned this strip of land at the time. Approached Columbia and said, "We'll offer you this much money for this strip of land because we want to build this canal." Columbia says no. So President Roosevelt kind of knows that there are people in Panama who could be incited to seek revolution and independence. So he kind of encourages that. Panama revolts against Colombia. They win their independence. An hour after they win their independence, we buy that strip of land from them, and now we have the Panama Canal. So the President of the United States used some of his power to inspire or help a revolution so that he could get the land he wanted. You think about that. I'll let you mull that over a little bit. Okay, so we got Panama. We build this canal. It takes 10 years to build this 50-mile long canal. But once it's built, it connects the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. So we can get all of our fleet of ships out quickly if we need it. If you have any questions about that, I can imagine things going on in your head. Ask me in the comments if you need to, okay? All right, now, kind of going along with this, Theodore Roosevelt believes a lot of our power will be in our Navy, and so he decides to build up our Navy, and he almost doubles the staff of our Navy and increases our battleships to have 25, I think. And so he increases the size of the Navy with new battleships, then sends them on a tour around the world. Now think about this. We're not going into battle. We're not going into war, and he didn't want to. But what was he doing? What do you do if you get a new bike and you drive it through and you ride it through your neighborhood? You're showing it off, right? You're saying, "Look at what I have." Okay? So here's his big stick, right? He's showing his powerful battleships all over the world so everybody will know, ooh, look at the power they have. Look at what they have. Look at that big cannon on that ship. Look at that. And he had them all painted white, which was not typical of the time. They were usually gray or steel, and he had them painted white, and he called it his Great White Fleet, and he sent them on this tour all the way around the world to kind of show his power. Interesting, isn't it? I think that's interesting. I think there would be a lot of people that had different opinions on that. But is it a bad thing for people to know how powerful you are? If they knew how powerful that you are, maybe they won't mess with you. I think that was his idea. Okay. All right. Another thing we have going on at the time is because you've got this president who's progressive, we also have other progressives that are working in other ways. And a lot of ways are they're journalists, they're writers, and they're looking and they're seeing injustice and they're seeing problems and they're digging it up and bringing it to the attention of the people who have the power to do something. And Theodore Roosevelt actually called these people muckrakers, meaning that they were digging in the mud and showing everybody the mud. And he used it as a negative term at the time, but then the journalism people actually took it on as like a badge of honor, that they were mucking up the things that were wrong and showing society. And there's a couple of these that stand out in my attention. One is a man named Upton Sinclair, and he wrote a book called The Jungle that talked about the horrible practices that were happening in the meat packing industry and the things that were not good that were being given to people to eat. And because of his book, laws were passed to improve the meat industry and to make national standards for food. And we call this food and drugs, but drugs meaning medicines, so that people can't just stick a label on something and sell it if it's not healthy or good for you. It has to be tested and proven before it can just be packaged and sent out. Another one is Jacob Riis, and he wrote this a while back, but it's starting to continue to have an effect. It's called How the Other Half Lives, and it was a book of photographs that showed the bad conditions of tenement living, which is basically like apartments, just one on top of the other, on top of the other. And he would show his pictures in these galleries to all these rich people would come in, and he would have his slide projector up and he would show pictures, and these people had no idea that people live like this. They were living with diamonds on their fingers and in the fancy hotels. Remember, we're Gilded Age kind of, and these people didn't know that there were people living in conditions like this, where they were just piled one on top of the other, and it was dirty and it was not clean. Okay. Meanwhile, modern world. The modern world is opening up. Okay, we've entered in the 1900s and so many things are changing. Okay, here's a few things. Harry Houdini, he's the magician who would like tie himself up and put chains on it, and then he would go underwater in a box, and then he would escape. Okay, if you remember our wax museum from last year, Randy was Harry Houdini. And so he's putting on his shows at this time. 1903, the Wright brothers make their first successful flight with a powered glider. So now we have airplane. Teddy Roosevelt's not afraid either. He was the first president to ride in a car, first president to ride in an airplane. I think he was the first president to go in a submarine. He was anything that was going on, he wanted a part in it. And part of why he did that was to get himself out there. He wanted to be in the public. He wanted people to see what he was doing. He wanted to be the popular one. His daughter said one time, "You have to understand my father. He has to be the bride at every wedding and the corpse at every funeral." What does that mean? He wants the attention wherever he goes, right? He's the center of attention. In 1903, The Great Train Robbery was one of more of a full-length movie. Remember the last one we talked about? Things are going so fast now. We just talked about The Sneeze, right? Being one that we could see. Now we have actually a full-length movie with actresses. Do we have sound yet? No sound. Silent movies. Black and white, silent movies. But you've got like, okay, that's the kind of movies you have. 1905, Einstein develops his theory of relativity. Don't know much about it. But you know Einstein, Albert Einstein, and I want you to know some of the things that are going on at this time. 1908, Anne of Green Gables is written by L.M. Montgomery. So a lot of you have read that or at least heard of the book, maybe seen the movie. Henry Ford begins production of his Model T. This is not the first car, but this is the first car that becomes affordable for more people to own. And so then more people can have a car and it becomes more popular. Fountain pens, you may take that for granted, but now we're no longer in the ink and having to dip the ink. Now we have a fountain pen that has the ink inside and it's not going to dribble all over your page and make a big mess. So that is coming about now. So I just want you to see what's going on, how times are changing. And this is the time where we're entering where we feel like we almost feel comfortable in this time. Before this, we didn't really understand it. It was things that were too foreign to us. But now we're getting into more of a modern era. Okay, now in the comments below, I want you to pick one thing that I talked about. It can be the events that I talked about, or it can be something from this screen. Anything that I talked about, what one thing do you think had brought about the most change or the most influence? What one thing do you think that I talked about brought about the most change or the most influence? Have a good day.